Now, so far in all of our Vue applications, we've declared any and all data inside the components themselves right here, like this. Now, more often than not, when we create websites, that data will be stored somewhere else instead, like in a database. And we normally have to fetch that data from an API endpoint or something like that. So in this small chapter, I just want to show you how we can fetch external data from inside a Vue component. Now, to begin with, we won't be working with a database because I don't want to introduce too many concepts at one time. So instead, we'll use a package called JSON Server to simulate an API that we can make requests to. So JSON Server basically allows us to use a simple JSON file like this containing data as a database resource with various different endpoints. So for example, I could create a JSON file called db.json with blog data inside it. I would then use JSON Server to watch that file and provide us with local API endpoints to interact with whatever resources we define inside that file. So JSON Server basically wraps our JSON file with API endpoints, and it gives us these endpoints so we can interact with this data. In this case, it would be /blogs to get all of the data. That would be a GET request. If we wanted to add new data, we'd send a post request to /blogs. To get a single blog, we'd go to /blogs/ID. So it provides these endpoints and more as well to interact with this data, and then we can do that locally from our Vue components. So JSON Server really just allows us a quick way, an easy way to work with local data that simulates how an API behaves. It's very good for learning, practicing and developing, and that's exactly what we're doing here. So the first thing I'm going to do to set this up is to create a db.json file. Now I'm going to create this in the root of the project, and generally when I work with data like this, I create a data folder and then I place it inside there. So let me create a db.json file. And by the way, you don't have to call it db, call it what you want. db just stands for database since we are storing data in it. Okay, so for those of you who have never worked with JSON before, it's very similar to how a JavaScript object looks. So it would start with curly braces, much like an object, and then we have key value pairs. But there are a couple of subtle differences. First of all of the keys must be in double quotes, and that's not the case in JavaScript objects. So when we create a key, we put it in double quotes like this. Now, when we're creating a JSON file for JSON Server, any top level keys are seen as resources. So for example, we want a jobs resource, and that would be the key. So this is going to be an array of data. Now what I'm going to do is just paste in 3 different objects so you don't have to watch me type them out from scratch. Now I wanted to just quickly mention the other difference as well in JSON than a JavaScript object, and that is that when we use a string as a value, the string must be in double quotes as well. If this was single quotes, it wouldn't be valid JSON. So this is our JSON file for the jobs resource. Now, if we had multiple different resources, for example, we could have jobs and we could have something else like blogs, then we just create another top level property like this. And then when we watch this with JSON Server, it would see we have 2 different resources and we could interact with both of those. So we only want one resource. I just wanted to show you that you could do that. I'm going to save it and close this off. The next thing we need to do is install the JSON Server package locally inside this project. Now to do that, we need to open up a terminal. Now I already have the local host for the Vue application running right here because we ran before npm run serve. So I need to open up a new terminal by clicking this button right here. And then over here, I'll say npm install. This is how we install a package locally, and the package is called JSON-server. Now, if you've got a really old version of Node, I think it's version 4 or less, anything less than 5, then you'll also have to use the save flag like so. But if you've got a newer version of Node, then you don't have to do that. So I'm going to press enter, and that's going to install the package locally into the computer. And it's local because we didn't use the -g flag, which stands for global, and that would install something globally on our computer. This was just locally. So now, if we take a look inside package.json, we can see that JSON server is now a dependency. That's been installed and it will be stored inside the node modules folder. So how do we actually use this to watch a file? Well, it's pretty simple. All we need to do is come down here in the terminal and say JSON server, like so, space, and then / watch to watch a file, and then the name of the file, the path to the file. Now, in our case, that's in the data folder /db.json. So I'm going to press enter, and now we can see that it's spun up a local development server on port 3000. That's different from our Vue website, which is on port 8080. So the JSON server is using port 3000, and then the endpoint to get the jobs is /jobs. If we had multiple resources, then we would have different endpoints. Let me just demonstrate that. I'm going to go to db.json and add in another resource again. So let me just say blogs, and that is going to be an empty array. Save that, and now we can see we have two different resources down here. So JSON server was watching this file for changes, it's noticed another resource, and it's given us an endpoint for that as well. We don't need it, so I'm just going to remove it again, and we're just going to use jobs. But if we now open this up in a browser, then it's going to send a GET request for this resource right here, and it's going to send back JSON with all of these different objects included. So let me try that. I'm going to open this up in a browser over here. I'm going to control click to do that. And now we can see we get all of this JSON back in the browser. Now, typically, we don't want to be sending GET requests for our JSON inside the browser address bar like this. What we want to do is send those requests from our components, for example, inside the jobs component right here, where we have all of these jobs. We want to send it from this component to retrieve that data so we can cycle through the data in the template and output it on the screen. So we're going to start that process in the next lecture. So now we have our db.json file with all our data in it, and we set up the JSON server to watch this and give us access to endpoints to interact with it and get the data. Let's try fetching the data from the jobs component. Now, at the minute, we're just creating the data directly inside this component, but typically when we make a project, we wouldn't do that. Our data might change over time and it would be stored in something like a database. Now, we're not using a database in this case, we're just using JSON server, but we will use databases later, and the concept of fetching the data from an external source are still the same. So the first thing I'm going to do is delete the data inside this jobs array. Now, I will keep the jobs property because ultimately we want to cycle through those jobs to output them to the screen. All we're going to do is fetch the data from this external source, and then we're going to populate this jobs property with that data. And then once it has that data, we can cycle through them. All right. So the first question is, where do we get this data? At what point? Well, a popular place to get it is inside the mounted lifecycle hook. Remember, a Vue component has lifecycle hooks which fire at different points during its lifecycle. The mounted one fires when the component mounts the DOM. So at that point, we're going to go out and fetch the data. Now, to do this, we'll be using the fetch API. Now, if you don't know much about fetch or promises or asynchronous JavaScript in general, definitely check out the last chapter in this whole course where I talk about different JavaScript features. I cover fetch and promises right there. So if this is confusing, check that out. So we need to pass in an endpoint to the fetch method, and that endpoint is provided to us by JSON server right here. So it's this thing to get all the jobs. So I'm going to highlight that and copy it, and I'm going to paste it inside here, inside a string, like so. So this is going to go out and fetch that data for us and return it in JSON format. Now, this is asynchronous and it returns a promise. So what I'm going to do is tack on a then method which fires a callback function after this is done. Now, this returns an object with JSON data included in it. Now, in order to actually get that data, that JSON, and pass it into JavaScript, we need to take the response, which we get as an argument here, and we need to use the JSON method on it. So we say response.json. This is how we work with the fetch API. Now, when there's only one argument inside the callback function, we can remove the parentheses, which is what I'm going to do. And this thing right here, this is also asynchronous, and that also returns a promise. So all we need to do is tack on another then method, which will fire another function when this is complete, and this function gets access to a different argument, and that is the actual parsed data. So whatever data we have right here, we get back. All right, so it's going to be an array of objects. So what do we want to do with that data? Well, all we want to do is populate this array right here with that data. Remember, this is an array of data. So all we need to say is this.jobs to get the jobs property that we have right here and set it equal to the data that we get back, which is an array of JavaScript objects, an array of jobs. And that's all we need to do. Now, since this might error, if something is wrong with the asynchronous task, we can tack on a catch block, which will fire a function if there is an error, and we get that error back as an argument inside this function. All I'm going to do is console.log the error.message if there is one. So every error that we get back will have a message property, which tells us what the error is. All we're doing is logging that out if there is an error. So now let's see if this works. Hopefully, everything should still look the same. We should see on the page these 3 jobs. So let me save this and preview. And this is the endpoint. We don't want that. I'm going to go to Ninja Jobs and then go to Jobs. And we can see we still have all of these 3 jobs. And if I hard refresh, we can see for a second it's blank while it makes the fetch. And then once we have the data, it outputs them. Because remember, to begin with, the jobs is just an empty array. It's only after we have the data right here that we populate that array and then we can output it. Okay, so that's how we get external data. We can make a fetch request inside the mounted hook to update a property, then cycle through that property to output it to the screen. Now, I also want to make a fetch request inside the job details component because currently all we're doing is outputting the ID over here. And we can see on a job details page, we see the job ID is 2. Now, I want the full data of that job. I want all of this stuff right here for that job so we can output the job title and the details, even though it's just one word. So I'm going to have to make another fetch request over here inside this component to get the job with the ID that we have right here. So again, let's do a mounted hook. And this is where we're going to fetch the data. So what I will do is go back to jobs and just copy all of this fetch request right here and paste it in right here. Now this time the endpoint has to be a bit different because we don't want all jobs, we just want a single job. So in order to get a single job, it has to be / and then whatever the ID is of the job we want to get. So in our case, it would be this right here, the ID of 2, if we were on this page. Now we have the ID, remember, we accept it as a prop when it's passed in as a wrap parameter, so we can use it and we can tack it on the end by saying plus this.id. This because we reference the component, and ID because we have that as a prop. All right. So now this will be either 1, 2, or 3, depending on what job we're trying to view. We're getting the response, we're parsing the JSON, then that data will this time be either an object, which is this job, or this job, dependent on the ID. And so we have access to that object. Now what I'd like to do is store that object inside some component data. So I'm going to create a data function, and inside this return an object. We need our comma after data, don't forget that. And I'm going to create a property called job. Now to begin with, that will be null. But once we have this data back from the fetch, I'm going to say this.job, not jobs, is equal to that data. So this will now be a JavaScript object, which represents one of those jobs. And we're also catching the error if there is one and logging it to the console. So now I have this job. We could maybe output those job details on the page because we have these different properties. We have the title and the details which we can use. So instead of this in the H1, I could output maybe the job title like so. And then at the bottom, I could do a paragraph and output the job details as well, like so. Now, if we try this in a browser, let me just save it, we're going to get an error, and I'll explain that in a second. First of all, let me just refresh over here. And notice now we don't get anything at all. Now, if we open up the console, then we're going to see an error over here. And if we scroll up, that error says, cannot read property title of null. So inside our template, we're saying job.title, and we can't do this because it's saying we can't get the title property from null. But why is this null? Because we're trying to retrieve a job object. Well, it's null because to begin with, when we first load the component, we set the job to be null. We only have a value for the job when we retrieve it using the fetch API, and that takes a second or so to get. So to begin with, when we first load the page, we're trying to output the title property of null. It's only when we have a value for the job that we can do that. So we need to figure out a way to conditionally output this stuff right here, only when we have a value back from the fetch request. And we'll see how to do that next. So we ran into the problem whereby this was causing an error, because to begin with, the job is null, and we can't access the title property on null. That makes no sense. It's only after the fetch request has completed and we update the value of the job to be the data that we get back that we can do this. So we want to only output this once we have a value for the job. And to do this, we're going to use v-if. Now, we've seen this in the past, whereby we can use the v-if directory to only output a certain amount of templates if a condition is true. So I'm going to create a div, first of all, and then I'm going to say v-if on this div and set it equal to something. Now, remember, if the thing inside this is true, then it will show whatever inside the div. If it's false, then it won't show this div and whatever is inside it. So I'm going to set that equal to job. Now, to begin with, job is null, and null is a falsy value. So it won't show this div and everything inside it to begin with. And then when we assign a value to the job using the data we get back from this fetch, then this will have a value. And since it has a value, it will evaluate as true. Any kind of value will be true. So now this would only output if we have a value for job. And at that point, we can say this, job.title and job.details, because then job will be one of these objects. So let's try this out now. Hopefully now we won't get an error. I'm going to save it and refresh. And now we can see the title and the details. All right, cool. Now we could also, if we wanted to, add a v-else. So I could say div, and then I'm going to say v-else. And so if this is not true, which it isn't to begin with, then we can output something like loading job details. So I'll do a paragraph tag and say loading job details, ... like so. And if I refresh over here, you'll see that flash up, this bit right here, for a split second until we have the data. And then once we have the data, it replaces that with the job data. So watch this. Very quickly, very quickly, impossible to see. But if you've got a slower connection, perhaps you'll see it for longer than I did. But either way, it was there. Now I'm going to do something very similar inside the jobs component. And I only want to output this stuff right here once we have jobs. Now, it doesn't really matter so much in this case because we have an array and that has a value. It's just that we can't cycle through an empty array. So even though it tries this, there's no jobs in there. It's not going to error. It's not going to cause an error, which is why we don't need to do a v-if around this. But I'm going to do a v-if around it so that I can do a v-else as well, so I can output loading jobs until we have the data. So let me now do a div at the top, and I'll say v-if is equal to jobs, and not just jobs, because it does have a value, and this will be truthy, but jobs dot length. Now, this will be falsy because it doesn't have a length. There's nothing in it to begin with. All right. So if I copy all of this stuff right here, when we cycle through the jobs, inside that, now this is only going to be output once there is a length inside here. Now I can do another div, and I can say v-else on that. And so if this is false, which it is to begin with, then I can output instead a paragraph tag saying loading jobs ... All right, so let's see if we have better luck with this. I'm going to go to jobs and okay, We didn't see that, but I think I'll hard refresh. And you could see it for a split second again. It said loading jobs. Watch this. Split second, loading jobs. So now we show this until the jobs are ready, and then we show the jobs. Okay, so that's how we can conditionally output template when we're waiting for data that we fetch. Now there's multiple ways of doing this, of waiting for data, especially in Vue 3. We might use a few different ways as we go forward. This is just one of them.